Well, welcome. I'm glad all of you are here. I look around and see so many friends, and I'm very, very excited you're here. Let me say something about worship a moment ago. I felt like the Lord was just reminding me of. I came from a background, and maybe some of you came from this background as well, that we were not exuberant during worship. Did anybody come from a church like that was not exuberant? Okay. And I remember years and years ago when the Lord dealt with me about that. I was standing in church one Sunday, and it was a church where I was just learning about being exuberant before God and expressing my worship. And I was just standing there, and everyone was kind of clapping, lifting their hands and all. And I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, "What would you do if I showed up? If I were standing on the platform like this and everyone was clapping and shouting, what would you do?" And I thought, well, Lord, I would clap and I would shout. And he just said very simply, "I'm here. I'm here." And so I just want to encourage you, if you've never shouted in church, but you've shouted at a football game, we have something better to shout about. Would you agree with that? So it's okay to express our love to the Lord. All right, if you would turn to two passages, John chapter 20 and Acts 9. We'll begin, we'll read one verse in John 20, and then we'll flip over to Acts 9, and we'll kind of go through Acts 9 through 13, some selected passages there. And I want to share a message with you that is a life principle with me. And about 6 months ago, I guess, I shared with our ministry staff this teaching. I never shared it with them. The church this April will be 10 years old. And they all said to me, you've got to share that at the Connect conference. And so I went to the Lord with it and talked to him about it, and I felt like he really wanted me to share it with you. This is a principle that we as leaders have to know. And I think that what I'm going to share with you, most of us know, but we get away from it. And we allow need to dictate our response, rather than the voice of God through this principle. So the title is, have you been sent or just called? Have you been sent or just called? 53 times in the book of John, Jesus uses the word or derivative of the word send. Send. Very seldom does he use the word called. But if you notice in our culture today, we hardly ever use the word sent in church. We always use the word called. I'm called. Pastor, you're not recognizing my calling. You ever had anyone say that to you? Well, I want to talk about the difference between a call and a send. Acts 20, verse 21 says, "As the Father has sent me, I also send you." As the Father has sent me, I also send you. So we got sent or send, two times the derivative of that word. But here's the word I want us to key in on in this verse, all right? As. As means in the same manner, in like manner, in the same way. So I want you to notice what Jesus said. The same way that the Father sent me, I send you. Now, have you ever thought about how the Father sent him? He didn't send him as the teaching 30-year-old prophet. He first sent him as a baby, right? Every one of us begin as babies in the kingdom. And then Jesus was a child, and then he was an adolescent, he was a teenager, And he was probably different than any teenager that has ever lived because he actually obeyed his parents. Then he was a young man, and he entered into business with his father. And until he was 30 years old, he never preached a sermon. Most scholars believe he was 30 and a half when he preached his first sermon. But we know he was 30, so we don't know at what time. But I want you to think about this. He's working in a carpenter shop. Is it possible that he ever made caskets? Knowing that he could just speak the word and raise that father from the dead so that there wasn't a widow and kids without a dad. Is it possible he ever made crutches? Is it possible that a sick child ever came into his carpenter shop who was going to die before he became an adult? 30 years. Until he was 30 years old. The creator of the universe did no ministry. None. Zero. Until he was 30 years old. Now, here's what gets me. In the same way the Father sent me, I send you. I guess what I'm wondering is, am I willing to wait for God to send me in the purpose of what he wants? When I was 30 years old, my senior pastor at the time and my spiritual father in the Lord, Olin Griffin, talked to me one day about being a senior pastor. I had been an evangelist, and now I was an associate pastor at a church, and I really thought I was called to be an evangelist for the rest of my life. And I thought, well, I'm doing this because I'm learning some things to be able to help churches more when I travel, and prophetic ministry and evangelistic ministry. I had never had the thought that I would be a senior pastor until my spiritual father spoke that to me when I was 30 years old. And he said, I see it happening in maybe 3 to 5 years. And I went home and I told Debbie about it, and the next morning I got before the Lord and I said, God, is this what you have for me, to be a senior pastor one day? And the Lord spoke very clearly to me and said, yes, but it won't happen until you're 38. When you're 38, it'll happen. And when I was 38 is when we planted Gateway Church. But God wanted to put some things in me, and look at what God has done now in 10 years. And I'm not saying that, you have to wait until you're 38. I was probably slower than most people. But I am saying that you have to wait for the send, and the send comes after the call. And there's a period between the call and the send. Just a couple examples from Scripture. Abraham was called to be a father to many nations when he was 75. He was sent when he was 100. And the temptation between the call and the send is to produce the call in the flesh. And that's what he did when he was 86. 11 years after the call, there was nothing, and so he and Sarah figured out how God was